So in recent months, we've seen significant civil unrest in South Africa, which looks like the result of an attempted coup by security agencies because of the sentence handed down to its former president, Jacob Zuma. Is that perception reality? Is the lawlessness that we're seeing in South Africa matched by what's happening on the ground, or does it appear worse than it really is?
Yeah, Chris, I think attempted coup is a good way of describing the situation. I mean, what we're seeing is politics by other means. We're seeing groups that have something to lose by a changing of the political and social order, acting out, working together and trying to seize the apparatus of state. Mind you, that's probably not what people will have heard here in Australia, where two other explanations have predominated. One coming from President Zuma and his supporters, that this was a spontaneous popular uprising against tyrannical judicial overreach, and the other that's been pretty popular in the international media, that this was really driven by inequality, poverty, all exacerbated by COVID-19. I don't think either of those hold a lot of water. I think what we're looking at is roughly what you've described: active agitation by elements in the security services of specific groups in South Africa. Those groups are minibus taxi associations, construction groups, other transport groups, criminal networks. And these groups really benefit from having a weak state. They benefit from having a state that has weak institutions in intelligence, in state security, in accountability, because that's where they make their money, at the municipal level, by offering services where the state can't, backed up by the threat of violence. These groups have been very well organised. They have a long history of paralysing key infrastructure assets in the country and paralysing the economy when they want their voices heard. None more so than the N3 highway between Durban, the main port, and Johannesburg, the industrial and financial centre. But they've also proven pretty subtle. They're very good at manipulating the language of Zulu ethnic politics. Almost all the unrest has been in KwaZulu-Natal or in Johannesburg townships with high Zulu populations. It hasn't been national. It hasn't been something that's been happening in the very poorest areas in Eastern Cape or Limpopo. And then you've got the final one, which is the kicker, which is the absence of the state has served as a real catalyst for the violence. Once there was a little bit of unrest, once it was apparent that the South African police was unwilling to restore order, looters stepped into the vacuum. So you add all of those elements together and you've got the dangerous situation that we've seen about 6 weeks ago.
And Jamie, how did South Africa get to this point? What is the elements in the last several decades that have caused South Africa to arrive in the situation it is now, given it should be such a wealthy economy?
Right, that's a big question. Probably a couple of things, and I'd lead off with the failure to invest in South Africa's human capital. That's been just devastating historically. The fact that South Africa's governments have invested in some people and not others, opened up education and skills to some people and not others, has just had huge repercussions for social participation, but also for the labour market, for the competitiveness of key industries, and for innovation. Why innovate if your lot in life is decided by your racial designation at birth? So that's been a big one. I'd probably add to that the failure to create public goods. South Africa has almost no history of governments that create goods for everybody in the society, and in that sense the ANC's corruption and cronyism is just a continuation of what we've seen historically in South Africa. And you'd add to that the creation of exclusive institutions. A lot of the core institutions in South Africa, the courts, the universities, they might look like their counterparts in Australia, but they're very exclusive and were designed as such. You need to have inclusive institutions to expand opportunity to the whole society, and South Africa hasn't historically had that. The final element is violence. It's a bit glib to say violence begets more violence or there's a spiral of violence, but there's now a lot of really interesting and rich social studies literature that shows that that's actually true. That one of the biggest factors in why social and political disputes get solved by violence in some places and non-violently in others is actually just if the participants expect them to be solved by violence and if they have direct experience solving such disputes by violence in the past. In South Africa, a lot of people have first or second degree experience of such violence, and in Australia, almost nobody does.
Jamie, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, which you can remind me what year that was, it seems like not that long ago, but it was a long time ago, there was a sort of small L liberal view in the world that, or in the West, that this was the dawn of a new age for South Africa. Certainly, there was no support for me or anyone I know for the apartheid regime as it was, but the sense that Nelson Mandela was a world leader, that he was going to begin a new age for South Africa, that there'd be peacefulness between whites and blacks. That hasn't turned out that way, certainly since Nelson Mandela departed. Was the ANC always going to end up running South Africa this way, and was Nelson Mandela just a one-off? He might have been an outstanding one-off, but a one-off that was never going to be repeated. And was this just the inevitable outcome of the ANC's view of the world and the way that they were created and operated for many decades before the end of apartheid? Should we have expected anything different?
I think that's very perceptive, Chris. I think it's important to look past the leaders and instead look at everything that's going on underneath the leaders in the party. And when you do that, you see two things with the ANC. You see a hegemonic position. In most forums of political competition in South Africa, the ANC is utterly dominant. And in some forums, the Democratic Alliance and the economic freedom fighters matter, but overall, it matters a lot more what different factions want. So intra-party competition is much more important overall than inter-party competition. That's not healthy in a democracy. It wasn't healthy during the apartheid era. It's not healthy in the ANC era. But then you couple that position with the culture. The ANC is a very complex, diverse, heterogeneous organisation, much more so than political parties in Australia. And on top of that, it's strongly influenced by anti-imperialist politics, struggle politics, Marxist politics, labour unionism. These are all strands of politics that don't necessarily subscribe to that liberal internationalist order that you were talking about, but instead have a very, very strong belief in solidarity, in factionalism, in resolving disputes behind closed doors and then closing ranks on the outside. Those influences are very dominant in the ANC. When you add that position with that culture, you get something that's pretty unhealthy.
Do you think President Ramaphosa has the capacity to bring this together in South Africa in a way that, you'd have to say the situation is not good, but do you think he has the capacity to bring the strands, or can you see a splintering of South Africa?
I don't think there's a lot of evidence that he can, but I think that'd go back to the earlier point, which is just the way that the ANC functions is that party dynamics are more important than whoever's driving the train, and I think there's probably a limit to what any leader can achieve. And I think the history of the four leaders of the ANC in government shows that to be pretty true.